This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 70 of the Photographing the West podcast, where twice a month we bring you interviews with interesting people doing interesting things. Each episode is brought to you by Photo Tees, wearable art using my photos and my designs. Available on Amazon, Etsy, and my website. Today I have with me storm chaser Eric Meola, and he's here to talk about storm chasing in general and his new book, Fierce Beauty. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, Kirby. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hopefully you're doing the same.
I am.
All right, great. So let me ask you, how did a New Yorker like yourself learn to love the Great Plains and write a book about storms on the Great Plains?
You know, I've traveled through the Great Plains ever since I was a kid. My parents went on a trip out west when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And unbeknownst to me, they were going to use the occasion to teach me how to drive a car. So we got out to Kansas, and we were headed into Colorado, and my dad was tired of driving, and he said, "Why don't you take over?" And we had this big old Buick, and I was obviously a bit nervous. I got behind the wheel, and I think in those days, you know, this would have been the late 50s. I think the speed limit out there, believe it or not, was 80 miles an hour, which I took quite literally. And I remember looking out the window, and it was flat as could be in Kansas. And I guess that was one of the reasons my dad let me drive there. But, you know, as we drove further west, we got into the Rockies, and I have to admit, I opened it up, and it, you know, at the age of 13, there I was driving at 70 miles an hour towards infinity. And I loved it. I mean, there was something about how flat it was. I think everyone's different in terms of the kinds of landscapes they like. And I actually, you know, I have no trouble going into an MRI machine. You know, I don't get claustrophobic, but as soon as you put me in the mountains, there's something about being surrounded by all those trees and not being able to see the horizon line that I really don't like. And, you know, if I go up into Maine, I am just lost. I really want to see the flat horizon. So when I was out in Kansas, in Nebraska, and, you know, South Dakota and all the Great Plains states, I loved it. I fell in love with that part of the country and with the flatness. So, you know, it had nothing really to do with being a New Yorker, and it had everything to do with just my own inner perception of the world.
I see. Talk about the tour company that you went with, and did you do any storm chasing on your own?
I didn't do any storm chasing on my own initially. I have done it recently, and that's a whole story unto itself. But I did a bunch of research, and the company I chose to go with is called Tempest Tours. And as I think I mentioned earlier, they come out of Arlington, Texas. They seem to have a great website, and I called up and spoke with a couple of their meteorologists. They had a good track record. They had done quite a bit of publicity, you know, worked with CNN and a number of other companies. And I liked what they had to say. You know, they really emphasized safety above everything else. And, you know, at some point you have to make a decision. And there really, at the time, were not that many companies, storm chasing is very seasonal. So these companies, their entire business is in the springtime when tornadoes form, usually in April, May, and June, a little bit of July. And then they shut down for the rest of the year. So there aren't a lot of them. There are even fewer good ones. Some of the companies had 3 or 4 chase vans, and Tempest operates with 2 chase vans, and that was really, to my way of thinking, a better situation for me.
So fear of people getting in the way?
Well, I think it's like anything else. The more vans that you have, the more people you have, the more people you have to find rooms for the evening. It's like turning a big ship around out in the ocean. Everyone's got to stop for lunch. That one person who's straggling can, make you miss a tornado. So, common sense and logic told me that, based on what I was reading at the website and some of my other research, that Tempest was a good choice.
Okay, sounds good to me. What's the experience of storm chasing like?
Storm chasing can be fantastic, and it can be incredibly boring. I think the hardest part about storm chasing is that, you're in a van for the better part of 14 or 15 hours a day. You might drive 400 or 500 miles a day. One of the first chases I was on, we drove 952 miles in one day. We were in Denver, and we drove all the way up into Saskatchewan because there was a high pressure ridge that was preventing storms from forming where we were going to be, down in Denver and Wyoming and Montana, and we had to keep driving further north. So the days are long. The food is terrible. You're grabbing something, you're grabbing fast food. Sometimes there's a sit-down meal. But for the most part, you're grabbing food, and you really don't even know where you're going to be staying that evening, because you might drive 500 miles, catch the storm, and it's now 11 o'clock in the evening by the time you finish. And you're out on a gravel road 100 miles from the nearest town. So part of what you're trying to do is, around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, you're trying to figure out, or the tour director is trying to figure out where you're going to be staying that evening. Often he doesn't know. The storms move quite quickly, and you might be, as I said, on a gravel road 100 miles from the nearest town, but you're not sure if you're going to be up to the north or down to the south. Part of the problem is that you're trying to figure out, where are you going to be the next day? Where do you need to set up for the next day? Is there going to be a storm the next day? And should you be chasing the storm you're on, or should you break off and go and chase this other storm, which is closer to where you're going to be, the next day?
Wow, that sounds like quite an experience. Sounds like you definitely need to take your passport, huh?
Well, you literally have to take your passport when you go up to Saskatchewan. So, what's interesting about the dynamic of storm chasing season is that the early storms in April form more in the southeast, down in, Louisiana and Arkansas, eastern Texas, and they gradually move west and north as the season progresses and you get into May and June. And so in the early part of the season, you operate out of Oklahoma City, and then the later part of the season, you operate out of Denver. And the The best chasing is later in the season because the light is better, the days are longer, and the storms move much more slowly. Early in the season, the storms are quite violent. They're often rain-wrapped, gray, and very difficult, to see and to chase.
So what's the technology involved in storm chasing these days, since you're out in the middle of nowhere?
Well, there's a lot of different technology available, and different chasers use different technology, but one of the most simple and basic things is an app for your iPhone called RadarScope, in which you can see live radar. Of course, we have GPS in the vans. We use Delorme maps, which, incredible detail in terms of being able to see old dirt roads and county roads. And, the Delorme maps are incredible, and we can see ourselves, obviously on the road in real time. There's a site called the Storm Prediction Center, and the Storm Prediction Center goes out for 3 days. Day 1 is always today. Day 2 is tomorrow, and day 3 is the following day. And they will mark fairly accurately where they think there are going to be storms and hail and possible tornadoes for that day. And they also have updates every few hours. There's a website called the College of DuPage. There's all sorts of streaming radar and websites and apps that you can go to, but they're only accurate up to a certain degree, and a lot of it depends upon having an onboard meteorologist. And as I mentioned, I think the one that is with Tempest Tours is a guy named William Reed, and there's another guy, Chris Gullickson. They've got a lot of experience, a lot of sixth sense. They watch every bit of data that they can get, including just driving up on top of the hill and getting outside of the van and looking out to the horizon. It's very, very technical, very complex, and involves a lot of last minute decisions. And part of what they are always trying to anticipate is, where are we going to be tomorrow? Where do we want to set up for today? Which storm do we want to chase that isn't going to take us so far away from tomorrow's target that we end up, in effect on the wrong storm? So unfortunately, sometimes, the decision you make today can affect your chase tomorrow. So all of this comes into play, and all of it's part of a decision that these guys have to make that simply doesn't really depend on having the best radar and the best everything, because a lot of it comes down to just making a decision about how it's going to affect the following days.
So a lot of it's seat of the pants, I guess, huh?
Well, a lot of it's seat of the pants, but part of what also goes on is that most storms start in the southwest and start moving from the southwest to the northeast. And very often you'll get a string of storms. You'll get 5 or 10 storms all in a diagonal row, southwest to northeast. And, that presents an initial problem of which storm do you chase. And what'll happen is one storm will eat away at another storm and prevent the storm from forming a tornado. So one of the ways of approaching that is to always go for what's called tail end Charlie. You go for the storm that's closer to the southwest. That's one approach. And then part of the decision becomes where do you go relative to the storm? Do you stay on the eastern side of the storm, or if it's at sunset when the light is absolutely fantastic, do you go over to the west side and photograph? The common procedure is to approach the storm from the east, get in close, because there's often quite a bit of haze between you and the storm, and then wait till the storm is played out and get over to the west side to photograph some of the lighting effects that you get late in the day.
So speaking of getting close to storms, how hazardous is storm chasing? A lot of people think storm chasers are crazy.
Yeah, well, storms themselves are relatively safe to approach. First of all, I'm always with a meteorologist. I've tried chasing on my own. It's a science. It's also sixth sense. It's experience, but you can get quite close when you're with a meteorologist. But usually the problems are more things like hail. You get very large hail in these storms, and you get lightning. Those are probably the two most obvious things of the storm itself, which are most dangerous. Very often we're photographing standing in deep grass. We'll just jump out of the vans. We have very little time. We run out into a field, so we've got a foreground, and we're standing waist deep in grass that might have chiggers and ticks and all sorts of other things, including snakes. Fairly common to run across a rattlesnake or two, at least on every trip. And fortunately, I don't know myself, and nor have I experienced actually stepping on a rattlesnake, but we've seen quite a few out there, and so far we've been lucky. But probably the most dangerous part of photographing a storm is other chasers. There's a thing called chaser convergence. So when you're working out of a big city or near a big city like Oklahoma City or Denver, every chaser in the proximity of those cities is going to be out there chasing that day, especially on weekends. And people get crazy, and especially if you've got someone in the group who hasn't chased before, they don't think about it. They walk right out into the street, and another van goes by, and then there's an accident or an incident. So traffic, driving, very, very long hours of driving, as I mentioned, it could be 200 miles a day. It could be 900 miles in one day. And the drivers get tired, and people let down their guards. So strangely enough, just traffic itself is probably the most dangerous part of storm chasing. Later in the season, when you're up in the Dakotas or up in Montana, there are a lot fewer chasers, and it's a lot safer. But, prime season is Memorial Day weekend. And if you were to look on a graph and, the months of the year on the bottom, on the x-axis, and you were looking at the number of storms that there would be per month, you would see that there's a bell curve that goes way up, on Memorial Day weekend. So Memorial Day weekend near Oklahoma City is, you're going to run into a lot of chaser convergence, whereas, the end of June up in northern Montana, you have a much better chance of being on your own.
Sure. Well, that's interesting. I guess most people worry about lightning and tornadoes and that sort of thing. So as in most things, I guess the humans are the danger.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about gear for a little bit. What kind of gear do you need to get good storm photos?
Well, it really depends on what you're after, but it could be something as simple as a wide-angle lens, a decent megapixel camera. You don't need anything more than that. First time I went out chasing, the widest lens I brought with me was a 24 millimeter lens, 24 to 70 zoom. And I somewhat cavalierly made the decision that, that'll be plenty wide enough to get everything I need. These days, I start at 14 millimeter and I go up through about 300 millimeter. I try to travel with as little gear as possible. You're working in rain, you're working in high wind. So you generally speaking want to have at least 2 camera bodies. And it's a good idea to dedicate a lens to each of those bodies. The idea is to not have to take the lens off because, with wind, you're going to get dust on the sensor. Finding a good wide-angle lens is very difficult because wide-angle lenses are notoriously sharp in the center and not sharp at the edges. And when you're photographing storms, there's not a lot of light. Very often you're jumping out of the vans with very little time to shoot. Sometimes you have enough time to put the camera on a tripod. Other times you're shooting handheld and there's very little time. So you're shooting close to wide open. You might be at 2.8, you might be at f4. You can close down more and push the ISO, but like all situations where you push the ISO, of course you get more noise. The problem with noise and storm chasing is that you're dealing with a lot of haze. You might be shooting over a distance of 3 or 4 miles. So although the storm appears close to you, could be 3 or 4 miles away from you, or a tornado could be 3 or 4 miles away from you. So when you look at your photographs and you see that it's not as distinct as your mind's eye saw the tornado, you apply clarity, and the clarity will bring out the contours and some of the more distinct structure of the storm and of the tornado. But when you apply clarity, you get more noise. So I like to shoot at ISO 100 as much as I can, sometimes even ISO 50. I try not to push beyond ISO 400. Once you get to 400 and you apply clarity, you're going to start to see noise. That's very evident. And as I said, getting a great wide angle that is sharp at the corners, whether it's Canon or Nikon or Sony, they all have some advantages and some disadvantages. But I always, whatever lens I'm using, I always test it way beforehand to make sure it's as good as it can be at the edges, close to wide open. Because as I mentioned, you're often shooting at 2.8 or f4 and not at f8. When you're working later in the season and you're up in South Dakota, North Dakota, and you have the summer solstice and it's June 21st and there's light until 9:30 or 10 in the evening, you've got plenty of light. But earlier in the season, when you're down in Southwest Texas and the storm is pitch black and all gray, you're dealing with very little light. Now, why do you really need sharpness at the edges if you're dealing with a cloud, what essentially is a big cloud? Well, because I always, and most chasers, want to include foreground. And if that foreground is just a strip at the bottom of frame, if that strip isn't razor sharp, then the image itself loses all of its sense of landscape and of dimension. So that tiny little strip at the bottom becomes extremely critical in terms of maintaining sharpness. Lightning triggers. Generally speaking, when I first was beginning to chase in 2013, the lightning triggers were not very reliable. There's a new one recently made by a Chinese company. The trigger is called Pluto, and it's quite dependable. You know, when it gets dark outside and the lightning, obviously, in contrast, is much brighter, you don't really need a lightning trigger. You just open up, you know, on bulb or long time exposure and just fire away. But if you're trying to catch lightning late in the day and there's still a fair amount of daylight, sometimes you'll use a trigger. So lightning triggers, I wouldn't say they're an essential part of gear, but you know, they can be important. A good tripod, you know, part of the problem with storm chasing is you're in high winds very often. So you're losing time by setting up the tripod. If you're going to do a time lapse, you need either an external intervalometer or you need a built-in intervalometer. I tend not to shoot with an intervalometer because I like to concentrate on getting the still photographs. And as I said, I'll usually work with two cameras, both with dedicated lenses. One will be like a 14 to 24, and the other would be like a 20 to 24 to 70. Usually both of them will be 2.8 maximum aperture, you know, and in the bag I'll carry a longer lens, a long zoom, or a long prime for those occasional shots when you know, something's at a greater distance.
So it looks like some of the photos in your book were aerial photos. Did you use a drone for any of your photography?
I did not use drones. You know, drones for storm chasing, there have been a few people who've tried them. You know, you need a really good drone that can maintain its stability. I haven't bought a drone or, you know, tried to fly one or experienced it crashing yet. But as I mentioned, you get very little time to set up. Very often when we're near a tornado, the tour leader will say, you've got 10 minutes to shoot, and then a minute or two later he'll change his mind and say, we got to get out of here now. So it's hard to abandon your drone in mid-flight and you know, jump back into the van. But it's something that intrigues me. I'm not quite sure why you think some of the shots may look like aerials, but you know, sometimes you are on a hilltop, and sometimes because of the distortion of the lens, it may appear that way. But you know, drones, you know, flying in those high winds are a stability issue. So you'd need a very powerful drone in terms of its being able to maintain flight. And as I said, if I was alone chasing on my own and I could dictate to myself that, you know, I'm going to get this no matter what, I'm going to stay here for 15 minutes and wait for the drone to come back, that would be one thing. But you are dealing with very high winds. You're dealing with outflow, you know, as the downdraft comes down from the storm, it moves out toward you, and it can be quite violent. And you're trying to stand up, and sometimes it's even hard to stand up. So trying to fly a drone in those conditions would be difficult.
Yeah, sounds like it. It looked in some of the photos like you were looking straight out at the clouds, and that's why I asked the question.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, I think, you know, different lenses have a different way of making the image appear distorted. You know, sometimes there's compression from telephoto lenses, but I haven't used drones. It is something on my list of things to try. And as storm chasing becomes more popular, I think we'll begin to see more of this. But I think it's something where the people who would use drones would tend to be people who are professional meteorologists and chasers who've been doing this for quite some time, because with our group, it's the safety of the group and the group moving as a unit to the next place that takes precedence. So it might be one thing to try to set up a couple of tripods for time lapses, but it's a whole other thing to try to set up a drone and be waiting for it to come back to you from wherever it is.
Okay, fair enough. So talk about the process of getting your book published. Did you have to self-publish? How much of an ordeal was it getting your book published, and what was the process?
I didn't want to self-publish this book. Self-publishing has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages, not the least of which is, distribution of the book. I also wanted the support that a publisher could bring. And by that, I mean, they have professional people, obviously, who do some very mundane things, but very important things like proofreading. And although I hired a proofreader on my own to proofread the copy, they did an incredible job, on many different levels. But going back further, I like to put a dummy together of the book. So I started doing a dummy of the book quite early. And I had envisioned the book as a large format book because I did some research and I found that all the books about storms up to that point had been quite small physically. And I didn't really understand that. Obviously, it had to do with production cost, but they were 9 by 12 inches, 8 by 10 inches, 7 by 9 inches. And, I saw this as a much larger book physically because storms, landscapes, they're always about the panoramic feeling you get from, looking out to the horizon. So I needed big images. So the smallest book I wanted was something about 11 by 15 inches. And I went to a company out in California that does large format dummies. It's called Edition 1. And as far as I know, they're the only company who does large format dummies like that. So starting from very early on, we started putting together, I hired an independent designer, and we started putting together various layouts. One of the mistakes I made early on was that I wasn't sure how much of the Great Plains themselves I wanted to put into the book. And I was really torn because on the one hand, I wanted it to be about storms, but I also wanted to include what I refer to as contextual photographs. So, I made a lot of photographs of abandoned houses and old prairie churches, small towns. And I realized that I was getting away from the book itself. It goes back to, when you were in third grade and trying to write that first essay, and the teacher said, now remember, you've got a subject and you got to stick to the subject. I looked at the book and I scratched my head and I said, what happened to the storms? There were a lot of storm pictures, but it was confusing and there wasn't really a flow. So doing the dummies helps you to see that. And as hard as it was, I took a lot of those photographs out, and eventually they might be part of another portfolio and another book. But with the dummy, you also have the advantage of being able to go to a real publisher and say, here's what I think it will look like. This is the way I see this. And most of the publishers I approached, I approached some who had done storm books before and some who had not. But the general feeling was that storm books had not done well up to that point because they were physically small. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but my common sense, my gut feeling that a large format book would be best really came in handy. I ended up presenting it to about a dozen different companies, and I'm not ashamed to say I got shot down by quite a few of them. And then some of them wanted me to partially invest in the book itself, which is becoming more and more common, and was not something I really wanted to do because I had spent a good part of my own money up to that point, just doing the trips and hiring a designer. So around Christmas time, I got a call from a company in Australia called the Images Publishing Group. They've done a lot of books on architecture and some gorgeous books on photography and art. I liked what I saw, and we spoke on the phone a couple of times. They sent me a contract, and by the end of last year, I had my contract in hand. And they were incredible. They stood behind me in terms of, they wanted they wanted the best paper possible for the book. They wanted the best printing, and they were instrumental in making the book what it is in many ways. So it's always a process getting your book published. I would strongly suggest that the frustration of trying to find a publisher is worth the time and trouble. But if you feel you have to self-publish, understand that one of the big disadvantages that I mentioned was distribution. It's going to be harder to get it out into the real world.
Interesting. So when's your book going to be published, and where, and how much is it going to cost?
The book is going to be officially available on November 11th of this year. Obviously, one of the easiest and best places to order it from is Amazon. It's $80 right now at Amazon. The list price on the book is $85. I'm not sure if it's going to go back up to $85 or what, but it's $80. Obviously, you can order it from Barnes & Noble. You can order it from Rizzoli in New York. But yes, it'll be available November 11th.
Okay. And where can people find your work and find you on the internet?
You can find my website at www.ericmeola, EricMeola.com. That's my website, and if you just Google me, you'll find all sorts of references to all sorts of portfolios and interviews.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for being on Photographing the West, Eric. I love your book and hope it does well for you.
Thank you, Kirby.
You're very welcome. Sincerely meant. Show notes can be found at www.flanaganphotos.com. Flanagan Photos is spelled FlanaganPhotos. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.